heiress, and then for a time with her aunt, James's sister, Henrietta Anne. When her aunt died prematurely in the summer of 1670 from what is believed to have been a ruptured ulcer, Anne was brought back to England. Ill health of the kind which had seen her sent to France as a child would plague her throughout her life. Back home, she and Mary were raised at Richmond, south of London. Their uncle, the king, insisted that they be brought up as Protestants despite the fact that their parents were both Roman Catholics. At Richmond, their education was broadly entrusted to the Bishop of London, Henry Compton. As she grew up, Anne would have become more and more conscious of issues surrounding the succession to the throne. When Anne was born in 1665, few people could have predicted that she might ascend to the thrones of England, Scotland, and Ireland one day in near succession to her uncle, King Charles II. After all, Charles had not long been married to Queen Catherine of Braganza from Portugal, and it was assumed that their union would soon produce an heir to the throne. Failing that, Anne's father might succeed Charles, but even if this did occur, Anne already had both an older brother and an older sister who were second and third in line to the throne, and there was also plenty of time for her parents to have further children, as they did, with two boys named Charles and Edgar arriving in 1666 and 1667. And yet, in the years following her birth, Anne only briefly moved further away from the throne in the lines of succession, and then quickly moved back closer to it. Charles, despite siring over a dozen illegitimate children, with half a dozen or so mistresses, never had a legitimate child with Catherine. Over time, it was increasingly realized that James would succeed his brother. But what was more, Mary and Anne would remain close to the throne in the line of succession, as their mother Anne died in 1671, and each of their 4 brothers died before reaching their 4th birthday. Thus, from the early 1670s onwards, Anne was third in line to the throne after her father and her only remaining sibling, Mary. All of this was further complicated by the fact that James was a Roman Catholic, a problematic religious adherence in a country where Protestantism and English nationalism had become forged together through a century of struggle from the Reformation of the 1530s down to the civil wars of the 1640s. In due course, their father's Catholicism would profoundly shape the course of both Mary and Anne's lives. Anne's life, as will become clear, was in many ways a tragic one, characterized by death and family discord. This had started early on with the deaths of all of her brothers in infancy. Her mother's passing in 1671 compounded this and was especially difficult for Anne, who had spent her younger years in France and barely knew her mother on any level before she died. To make matters worse, when her father remarried in 1673 to Mary of Modena, Anne did not take well to her Italian stepmother, and their relationship was fraught. As a result of all of this, the person Anne was closest to was her sister Mary. But in 1677, this relationship too was suddenly cut short when Mary was married to William of the House of Orange, the Dutch stadtholder, and she left for the Low Countries. Bereft of her family, Anne turned to her friend, Sarah Jennings, with whom she would develop a lifelong companionship. 5 years Anne's senior, Jennings married John Churchill, the future first Duke of Marlborough, in the winter of 1677. Anne's relationship with the Churchills would have an enormous bearing on her life and her government after becoming queen, though there is no conclusive evidence of any kind to suggest that her relationship with Sarah was sexual in nature, as some portrayals have suggested. The late 1670s and into the early 1680s brought fresh difficulties for Anne, as national hysteria over a fictitious Catholic plot saw wide-ranging scrutiny of her father's Catholicism and even an attempt in Parliament, unsuccessful though it was, to exclude James from the succession on account of his religion. James and his second wife spent time away from England in the Low Countries and then in Scotland in the midst of what is termed the exclusion crisis. Anne joined them for a time in these forays away from England. By the time they finally returned home in 1682, negotiations with several European aristocratic and royal families were underway to see who Anne would marry. In the end, the choice fell on George, Prince of Denmark and Norway, a brother of King Christian V of Denmark and Norway. The union was negotiated on the basis that England had become overtly reliant on an alliance with the Dutch through Mary's marriage to William of Orange, and so a Danish alliance would extend England's foreign policy choices in the event of a European war. The wedding was celebrated in July 1683 at St. James's Palace. George was 30, Anne was 18. Anne became pregnant within weeks, though the pregnancy resulted in a stillbirth the following year, the first of a dozen stillbirths and miscarriages which Anne would suffer in a torturous natal history. Anne's uncle, King Charles II, died on the 6th of February 1685. Despite his large brood of illegitimate children, his marriage had not resulted in an heir, and he had resisted advice to act like a latter-day King Henry VIII and divorce his wife and remarry in order to produce a legitimate heir. Therefore, Anne's father succeeded as King James II. The accession of a Catholic monarch, the first Roman Catholic to rule England since Queen Mary Tudor back in the 1550s, was problematic, though in an era when the scientific revolution and the first dawning of the European Enlightenment were beginning to dispel the most severe elements of the religious tensions that had characterized Europe since the start of the Reformation of the early 16th century, it was possible that James could rule in harmony with a political community which was overwhelmingly Protestant. He destroyed any possibility of that happening by taking an aggressive approach to religious policy, openly promoting Roman Catholics to positions of high office, relaxing laws which favoured Protestants over Catholics, and in Ireland holding out the possibility of a complete revolution in landholding to favour the Irish Catholics who had been robbed of their land in the course of the 16th and 17th centuries by Protestant settlers from England, Wales and Scotland. Within a year or two, huge tensions were building between the new king and the political community, but many noted that James was already in his mid-50s, and as his second marriage had only produced 2 children who died in infancy up to that point, they looked towards James dying soon and his Protestant daughter Mary returning from the Low Countries to succeed him. Anne's relationship with her father and stepmother became more tense, owing to the growing political crisis, as she was a convinced Protestant and viewed her father's religion as quasi-idolatrous. This was a difficult time for her in more ways than one. Her initial miscarriage in 1684 was followed by years of further miscarriages and stillbirths, and also the death in infancy of any children that were born alive. 1687 was a particularly cruel year. In late January, she suffered another miscarriage. Just 2 weeks later, a daughter named Anne that she had given birth to in May 1686 died as a smallpox outbreak ravaged Anne's household. 6 days later, her only other surviving child, a daughter named Mary after her aunt and born in June 1685, was also claimed by the smallpox outbreak. Finally, after quickly becoming pregnant again, Anne suffered another stillbirth in October, effectively losing her 4th child in the space of 9 months. A further miscarriage followed in April 1688. Unsurprisingly, reports at the time indicate that Anne and her husband were emotionally devastated by what had happened in 1687. What made these events particularly cruel was that little Anne and Mary were not miscarriages or stillbirths, but were otherwise seemingly healthy infants before being claimed by smallpox in February 1687. As the years went by, and more miscarriages and stillbirths followed, Anne must have reflected on what might have been had it not been for the disease entering her household early that year. By the time Anne suffered her miscarriage in April 1688, her stepmother, Mary of Modena, was heavily pregnant. In June, she gave birth to a healthy baby boy. This precipitated the immediate development of a political crisis in England, where many had been banking on James dying before long without a Catholic heir. The birth of a son who would be raised now as a Roman Catholic opened the possibility of decades of state efforts to re-Catholicize England. In this environment, a letter was quickly dispatched to the Low Countries from some of the leading aristocratic and political figures of England, one which called on Anne's brother-in-law, William of Orange, to claim the thrones of England, Scotland and Ireland from King James by right of Mary's position in the line of succession. What is termed the Glorious Revolution followed as William crossed to England in early November of 1688 with a Dutch army and seized control of England. Almost no resistance of any kind was offered, and James fled to France, where he sought aid from King Louis XIV, a monarch who had been at war intermittently with the Dutch for many years, and who did not wish to see the most powerful Dutch political figure of the day now in control of Britain. Mary soon crossed to England to join her husband, and she and William were crowned as co-monarchs, Queen Mary II and King William III, at Westminster on the 11th of April 1689. Anne's response to all of these events was plain for all to see. Although James was her father, she disliked his second wife and reviled his religious stance, while her close friend, Sarah Churchill, advised her to abandon her father. Anne duly did this, fleeing from Whitehall as the political crisis developed following William's landing in England. When she returned to London after her father's flight to France, she was unperturbed by his exile and deposition and greeted her brother-in-law warmly. There were self-interested political reasons at work here as well. Anne's sister's marriage had not resulted in children, yet another prong of the wider Stuart family's difficult familial history, and, as such, Anne was now the heir to her sister and brother-in-law. Furthermore, she was pregnant again, and against all odds, Anne gave birth to a healthy baby boy named William after his uncle-in-law, the new king, on the 24th of July 1689. Prince William would live longer than any other child of Anne's, though he too would eventually fall prey to the family curse. While the coronation was being planned and held and the new rulers were settling into governing the three kingdoms, war was brewing. James did not intend to take the loss of his thrones lying down, and in France, King Louis XIV was happy to exploit the situation to launch a new war against the Dutch Republic and England. James also acquired huge support in Ireland, where the Catholic majority had hoped for years of favourable treatment under a Catholic monarch. Thus, what is known variously as the War of the League of Augsburg or the 9 Years' War broke out and would last down to 1697. The major focus of it in the early years was in Ireland, where James headed to take control of the country and use it as a springboard to reclaim England. William met the challenge here, and in the course of 1690 and 1691, the war there was won for the Protestant cause. James fled back to France and would spend the remainder of his life in exile there. The legacy of the revolt in Ireland would later have a bearing on Anne's government and policies. Anne's position within the new government and royal setup was a difficult one. On the one hand, there is no doubt of the sisterly affection between Anne and Mary, one forged through family trauma. While death and religious differences had either killed or driven apart everyone in their extended family, Anne and Mary had found common ground. This was balanced out, though, by other factors. Firstly, Anne had a difficult relationship with William, who she perceived as being responsible for blocking her requests for a large pension and the use of Richmond Palace, decisions which were tied to his desire for a tight purse at home when money was needed to finance the continuing war with the French. The frostiness increased early in 1692 when John Churchill, the husband of Anne's closest friend Sarah Churchill, came under suspicion of being in contact with the exiled King James in France and being supportive of the Jacobite cause. The name for the supporters of King James derived from the Latin version of James, Jacobus. Churchill was subsequently stripped of his political and military positions, and Mary pressured Anne to dismiss Sarah from the social position she held in her household. Anne refused, and the incident led to the development of a Cold War of sorts between her and her sister and brother-in-law, with Mary and William attacking Anne's financial perquisites in an effort to make her toe the line. These familial difficulties were compounded by Anne's continuing natal issues. Another daughter, again named Mary, as it was common practice at the time for the names of children who had died in infancy to be reused, had survived only a few hours in October 1690 after being born prematurely. The same experience repeated itself with a son named George in April 1692. There would be 8 further stillbirths and miscarriages down to 1700, with 4 miscarriages alone in the course of 1696 and 1697. Additionally, contemporary reports suggested that in the case of at least one of these miscarriages, and perhaps 2, Anne was carrying twins. In total, she would have 12 miscarriages and stillbirths, while of the 5 children who survived birth, only one, Prince William, born in 1689, survived to see his 2nd birthday. There has been considerable debate as to how Anne had such a tortured natal history, brutal even by the standards of the time, when 1 in 3 children would not survive infancy. Theories have ranged from lupus, an autoimmune disease which causes the body to attack healthy tissue, to severe diabetes or pelvic inflammatory disease. Rhesus incompatibility, a blood complication, is also a possible culprit, as this makes pregnancy more and more difficult the more miscarriages and stillbirths are suffered, and Anne did indeed worsen over time, with all 8 of her final pregnancies being stillbirths and miscarriages. To complicate matters further, Anne was herself an increasingly unhealthy woman, suffering from gout and other conditions which left her overweight and unable to walk any lengthy distance unaided from her early 30s onwards. In the early winter of 1694, Queen Mary came down with the same condition which had robbed Anne of 2 of her few healthy children 7.5 years earlier: smallpox. She died from it on the 28th of December 1694. Anne was pregnant at the time of her sister's illness and wrote to Mary that she wished to attend to her on her sickbed, but Mary refused. Whether this was owing to a concern that Anne had not had smallpox and could contract a highly contagious and dangerous disease, or was the product of the falling out between the sisters, is unclear. The result was that Anne never saw her sister again. Her only family now were her husband and her one surviving child, Prince William, and her father and his second family in exile on the continent. She did not succeed as queen at this point. Instead, William would continue to rule as king, though an agreement between he and the English Parliament stipulated that any children which he might have if he remarried would be excluded from the succession, and Anne would succeed him if she outlived her brother-in-law, a dispensation arrived at in order to prevent the widely disliked Dutch king from effectively creating a foreign royal family to rule over England. Thus, from the final days of 1694, Anne was only one further death away from the throne. By the time of Mary's passing in December 1694, the 9 Years' War had begun to peter out, yet one more European conflict of the time which started in a wave of energetic campaigns and then descended into stalemate and a huge bill for all parties involved, with little of consequence being achieved. The Peace of Ryswick, which was agreed on in 1697, was effectively a return to the pre-war situation, with only some minor border changes in the Low Countries, and an acknowledgement by the French of William's succession and James II's deposition. James would live out the rest of his life in France until he died there in 1701. His son and grandson then became the focus of the Jacobite cause into the 18th century, and efforts were launched in 1715 and as late as 1745 to restore this Catholic branch of the House of Stuart to the throne. Anne would never live to see those revolts, though in the second half of the 1690s she did enter into a brief correspondence with her father on the continent, in which she requested James to acknowledge the legitimacy of her succession if she did succeed William in the near future. The end of the 9 Years' War only brought a brief respite to Europe from the conflicts which dominated the relations between states in the early modern era. Already in the Peace of Ryswick, provisions had been laid out for dealing with the growing succession crisis in Spain, where the ruling monarch, King Charles II, was an ailing young man who had suffered from what seems to have been hydrocephalus and other conditions for his entire life. He was also impotent and unable to have children through either of his marriages, and it was evident that without a clear heir, his passing would bring a fresh crisis in the Iberian Peninsula. Despite the best efforts to ensure a smooth transition, Charles himself complicated matters shortly before his death at the start of November 1700 by naming as his successor his cousin, Philip of Anjou, his half-great-nephew on account of being the grandson of Maria Theresa, Charles's half-sister. The only problem was that Maria Theresa had married King Louis XIV of France decades earlier, and so Philip of Anjou was a member of the French royal family. His succession as King of Spain and master of Spain's empire in the Americas could not be tolerated by other powers such as England and the Dutch Republic, while the Austrians were opposed too, as their ruling family were related to the Spanish Habsburgs, and they perceived that an Austrian candidate should become the next King of Spain. The dispute escalated in the course of 1701 into the War of the Spanish Succession, pitting France, Spain, and a number of German states such as Bavaria against England, the Dutch Republic, Austria, Prussia, and eventually Portugal and Savoy as well. Although the war began when William was still on the throne, it would dominate Anne's reign in particular. As the war was breaking out with France and Spain, Anne's tragic family history was coming to its dreadful conclusion. Her 17th pregnancy resulted in another stillbirth at the end of January 1700. She might have consoled herself that at least one of her 5 children that had been born alive had survived to an age where it seemed he would grow to be an adult. But at Prince William's 11th birthday celebrations, on the 24th of July 1700, he became extremely fatigued and became ill thereafter. This developed into a fever the following day, and his condition deteriorated rapidly. His physicians drew off blood, a common medical practice at the time. It was all to no avail, and on the 30th of July 1700, he died. The cause of his death is still contested. Some suspected smallpox or scarlet fever at the time. The medical consensus today is acute bacterial pharyngitis, which also led to pneumonia and was further complicated by hydrocephalus. Anne was clearly devastated at the loss of her last child, and for the remainder of her life, the 30th of July would be reserved as a day of mourning within the royal household. Prince William's death also further complicated the succession, as Anne would now have no heir. Hence, early in 1701, the English Parliament began the process of implementing an Act of Settlement which legally disbarred any Roman Catholic from succeeding to the throne of England, a move designed to prevent James II's son attempting to succeed Anne in years to come. Who might become monarch down the line remained a point of contention, but the English political community was adamant that it would not be a Catholic. Anne would be on the throne before long. William III survived long enough to oversee the initial stages of the War of the Spanish Succession, but he died not long after, on the 8th of March 1702. Days later, she gave a well-received speech before the English Parliament in which she highlighted the fact that William had been a foreign interloper from the Dutch Republic and welcomed a return to a fully English monarchy, notwithstanding the fact that the House of Stuart was Scottish to begin with. Anne's coronation was organised and held relatively quickly on St. George's Day, the 23rd of April 1702. It was an unusual ceremony, given that the new queen was now largely unable to walk on account of her gout, and so she was carried through Westminster Abbey during the ceremony by the yeomen of the guard. It was a sombre affair in many ways, one in which beyond her husband there was virtually no family left alive to participate. Upon becoming queen, Anne was something of a non-interventionist monarch. Over a period of centuries, England had developed as constitutional monarchy, where Parliament was more powerful than in virtually any other European nation at the time. The king or queen of the day had still been in charge of the country until the 17th century, but the civil wars of the 1640s and then the Glorious Revolution of 1688 had finally tipped the balance in favour of Parliament, with legislation effectively passed after William and Mary assumed the throne that the Crown could not dictate national policy. Instead, henceforth, it would always need the rubber stamping of Parliament. With this, the Parliament became the primary body which controlled the government and policies of England and then Britain. Unlike some of her successors, notably King George III, who in the first half of his long reign attempted to control national policy on certain issues, Anne was happy enough to let the lawmakers in Parliament run affairs. Some of her initial interventions were significant and included promoting her husband to become Lord High Admiral in charge of the Royal Navy and the advancement of her great friend Sarah Churchill's husband John as Captain General to oversee the war effort against the French and Spanish. He was also made Duke of Marlborough and one of England's premier peers in 1702. Marlborough's promotion was important as he was soon involved in some of the most consequential military actions England engaged in during the early modern period. In the early years of the War of the Spanish Succession, England's ally Austria faced an internal challenge when Francis Rákóczi, a leading Hungarian nobleman, took advantage of the war and revolted against the government in Vienna, with the French also making moves to descend on Austrian territory through Germany and northern Italy, along with their ally in southern Germany, Bavaria. It became imperative for the English and the Dutch to come to Austria's aid before Vienna itself was threatened. The result, fought on the 13th of August 1704 in southern Germany, was the Battle of Blenheim, named after the village of Blindheim nearby and rendered into English as Blenheim. Here, Marlborough won a comprehensive victory over the French and Bavarians, one in which half of the 55,000 or so Franco-Bavarian array of troops were either killed, wounded, or taken prisoner, compared to around 5,000 English and Allied troops. Victory at Blenheim stopped the advance on Vienna, saved the Grand Alliance of England, Austria, the Dutch, and their other allies from collapsing, and deprived the French of the killer blow they were looking to strike. Marlborough was a war hero, celebrated across Europe. At home, in the aftermath of the battle, he and Sarah began construction of Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire, a magnificent country house and estate which Anne helped finance the construction of over many years. It is truly one of England's greatest country houses and has been designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Victory at Blenheim prevented the French from winning the war against England and its allies. Anne's government had many years of fighting in front of it, though. In the course of her reign, the War of the Spanish Succession developed into a conflict which ranged far and wide. It was not simply fought by armies in Western Europe. Large naval detachments were operating far from England and France in the Mediterranean and in the Americas. Thus, just 2 weeks before Blenheim, a giant Anglo-Dutch expedition landed at and occupied the Rock of Gibraltar in southern Spain. It would remain under English control. Similarly, Anne's navy and armies occupied the island of Minorca in the Balearic Islands in September 1708, as England's emerging greatness as a sea power came to play a major part in the war effort. Elsewhere, however, the war began descending into a war of attrition on fronts in the Austrian Netherlands, the region around modern-day Belgium, where an English expeditionary force fought alongside the Dutch and Austrians against the French. There were also clashes in North America and the Caribbean, notably along the Hudson River where French and British colonial interests overlapped. While all of this was significant, a decisive blow wasn't struck by either side, and the war dragged on and on for years through Anne's reign. While Anne did not play an overly active role in state affairs, she did, like all royals, patronise the arts and learning in England. She was, for instance, a major patron of Godfrey Kneller, a German-born portrait artist who had moved to England in the late 1670s. There, he became the leading portraitist in the country, and his depictions of the scientist Isaac Newton and the philosopher John Locke are well known. Anne commissioned him to produce a series of paintings on England's leading naval commanders, works which are in the National Maritime Museum today. She was an even more active patron of the Swedish painter Michael Dahl, who painted portraits of both Anne and her husband. Her love of animals was on display in her commissioning of a series of paintings by the Hungarian artist Jakob Bogdani, a figure known for his depictions of animals and exotic birds within pastoral landscape settings. In the sphere of architecture, she commissioned Nicholas Hawksmoor to build the Orangery at Kensington Palace, a building which Anne used for socialising at Kensington and which was innovative in the installation of a form of central heating under the floor and the provision of a conservatory for plants. Finally, she had Henry Wise, one of the most prominent landscape architects and gardeners of the era, lay out new gardens at both Kensington and Hampton Court. Though Anne's own personal inclinations were to play a minimalist role in managing government affairs, her reign did see many important political developments on the domestic front, and as Queen, she had a role to play in whether or not she agreed to sanction legislation. For the most part, when it came to religious policy, she was happy to conform to what Parliament suggested. The Test Acts and other measures during her uncle, King Charles II's reign had sought to limit the ability of Catholics to hold public office in England. These measures were strengthened, as was the official policy of favouring moderate Protestantism, the latter through passage of the occasional Conformity Bill, one which sought to prevent Protestants like the Baptists who dissented from the established Church of England, of which Anne was the supreme head, from also holding office or sitting in Parliament. It took until 1711 for this bill to gain official sanction, Parliament having rejected it twice previously, once in 1702 and again in 1704. On the latter occasion, the bill had in part been rejected as religious dissenters whipped up public sentiment about the ungodly nature of the bill in the aftermath of the Great Storm of 1703. This hurricane-like cyclone storm had passed through southern England and London, replete with lightning and extensive flooding, late in November 1703, peaking around the 26th of the month. It destroyed thousands of homes, ripped thousands of trees out of the ground in the New Forest, and toppled thousands of stone chimneys in London. Hundreds of merchant, fishing, and even navy ships were also lost in the English Channel, damaging the war effort against France and Spain. The fatalities are understood to have veered towards 10,000 people in an event which the Baptists and others subsequently depicted as a sign of the anger of God concerning the proposed passage of the occasional Conformity Bill. Part of the Tower of London was even damaged. In the midst of the storm, Anne was at St. James's Palace around Whitehall and Westminster when the storm struck London. She and her household staff had to shelter in the cellar in order to avoid the hazards created by collapsing stone chimneys and parts of the roof. Afterwards, she referred to the storm as, quote, "a calamity so dreadful and astonishing that the like hath not been seen or felt in the memory of any persons. The delay in returning to the occasional conformity bill after the Great Storm and its rejection in 1704 was due to the shifting of attentions northwards to Scotland. Scotland had been England's bitter rival throughout the High Middle Ages, late medieval period, and into the early modern era. But in 1603, all of that changed when Anne's great-grandfather, James VI of Scotland, succeeded Elizabeth I of England on account of his descent from a sister of King Henry VIII. This united the crowns of England, Scotland, and Ireland into a triple monarchy, with James becoming known as King James I of England and Ireland and James VI of Scotland. While monarchical union was achieved, Scotland retained large amounts of independence, notably its own parliament and a semi-independent administration at Holyrood in Edinburgh. There was no greater sign of this continuing autonomy than in the late 1630s, when King Charles I, Anne's grandfather, tried to intervene in the management of the Scottish Church, or Kirk, and ended up at war with the Scots for his troubles. It was during Anne's reign that this arrangement came to an end, and Scotland was politically subsumed into a more centralised British state. The immediate causes of this were complicated. For one, Scotland had gone through a very challenging economic and social crisis in the 1690s and early 1700s. One facet of this was a brutal famine that lasted much of the decade and which is referred to in Scottish history as the 7 ill years. Mass fatalities had occurred in Scotland as a result of the famine, and tens of thousands of people fled the country to Ulster in the north of Ireland. Others looked even further afield, and an ill-conceived plan was initiated by the Scottish political and business community to try to colonize the Darien region surrounding the Isthmus of Panama in Central America. This venture ended in complete failure and worsened the economic situation further in Scotland. However, as significant as the economic considerations were, what really drove the campaign to tie Scotland more closely to England during Anne's reign was the passage of the Act of Security by the Scottish Parliament in 1704, a measure which stated Scotland's willingness to choose its own successor when Anne died, independent of England. This, combined with Scotland's reticence about contributing financially or materially to the war effort, led to outrage in England and, indeed, Anne had stated her desire early in the reign to bind Scotland more closely to England. The English Parliament went on the attack in 1705 by passing the Alien Act, which effectively threatened to treat Anne's Scottish subjects as foreign subjects if the Scottish Parliament did not repeal the Act of Security. Anne approved of these measures, and she went further in 1706 by sanctioning the creation of a commission to introduce an Act of Union to both the English and Scottish Parliaments. Under the terms of this, the Scottish Parliament would be dissolved, along with the independent status of the Scottish Crown, thus forming England and Scotland into the unified state and monarchy of Britain. Through a carrot-and-stick approach of economic and political threats and concessions on many issues, the government succeeded in having the Act of Union passed both in England and Scotland. It became law in 1707, and Anne ceased being the Queen of England, Scotland, and Ireland, and instead became the first Queen of Great Britain and Ireland. The Act of Union was the most significant political development of her reign, and its legacy is still felt today. Anne's reign was of note in terms of the governance of Ireland too. Ireland continued to have its own parliament, and the government there was headed by a viceroy in Dublin, appointed as the monarch's direct representative. This aside, constitutional arrangements did dictate that parliamentary legislation in Ireland had to be managed from England. So the final say on any policy for the country was decided at Westminster. One such policy during Anne's reign was the extension of the penal laws. This was a series of punitive pieces of legislation which had been introduced since the mid-1690s to disenfranchise Roman Catholics in the country politically, socially, and economically, even more so than they already had been by the end of the 17th century. The legislation was brought in as a response to the support Anne's father had garnered amongst Catholics there after he was deposed by William and Mary. These penal laws included everything from precluding Catholics from inheriting land or possessing firearms, to even placing restrictions on owning horses or receiving an education. Perhaps the pettiest was a ban on the use of stone and bricks to construct Catholic churches. Instead, they had to be built out of wood. The penal laws, many of which were passed in the 1700s after Anne ascended, paved the way for 2 centuries of a form of apartheid rule in Ireland, with a small Protestant ascendancy class completely dominating the Catholic majority. Ultimately, they were counterproductive, as Britain would have to deal with constant rebellions and agrarian terrorism in Ireland. Back in England, the politics of the era began to place a strain on Anne's relationship with Sarah Churchill. There were, by this time, 2 clear embryonic political parties in the English Parliament. Up until the 17th century, there had been no organised parties, merely factions that formed in support or opposition to one policy or another. That changed during Anne's uncle's reign, as 2 distinct groups emerged. One was conservative and more loyal to the Crown. These were derogatorily called Tories by the more liberal-minded members of the House of Commons, a term otherwise given to an Irish bandit of sorts. The Tories eventually formed into a cohesive party, the direct forebears of the Conservative Party in the United Kingdom today. Their opponents by the 1700s were the Whigs, the more liberal members of Parliament who believed the Crown should play a more limited role in governing England. Anne was, by disposition, more inclined to favour the Tories. However, her closest friend, Sarah Churchill, was a supporter of the Whigs, with her husband being one of the party's leaders, and by the mid-1700s, she was increasingly using her influence over the Queen to promote their policies and convince Anne to appoint Whig MPs to positions of high office. Anne placated her for quite some time, but by 1706 and 1707 she had grown weary of Sarah's meddling, something which also led to Anne's growing friendship with Abigail Hill, the daughter of a prosperous London merchant who had been offered a position in the Queen's household staff back in 1704. Matters came to a head in 1708. There were a number of factors that led to this. One was the so-called Screw Plot. This involved an alleged attempt to assassinate Anne during a Thanksgiving Mass which was offered to celebrate the British and Dutch victory over the French at the Battle of Oudenarde, in what is now Belgium, that midsummer. Screws were found loosened off the supporting beams of the roof of St. Paul's Cathedral in London, directly above the royal bench, and some speculated that the Whigs had conspired to have the beams crash down and kill Anne, who right at that time was leaning more towards the Tories in government and Parliament. Sarah and Anne also argued at the doors of St. Paul's Cathedral before the Mass over the choice of jewels worn by Anne. Then, just weeks later, Anne's husband died. Anne, after so much death in her life, was bereft, but the domineering Sarah chose not to console her, instead ordering that portraits of George be taken down in the royal residences, claiming it was best for Anne not to see these while grieving. The Queen clearly did not take kindly to this idea. All these occurrences led to a growing rift between Anne and Sarah. More broadly, though, despite the rupture between friends, Anne's reign has been viewed as marking a positive move towards a two-party system within England's politics, one which was emulated in decades to come in the United States and other countries. Anne has also left her imprint on the history of horse racing in Britain. Horse racing grew enormously in popularity in England in the 17th century, and in particular during the reign of her uncle, Charles II, who patronised the development of Newmarket near Cambridge as one of the main racecourses of Britain. There were several reasons for this. One was the decline of the popularity of hunting amongst the royals and the aristocracy, something which was the chief pastime of 16th century monarchs like Henry VIII, and which had military overtones. As the monarchy and nobles became more sedentary and less engaged in military affairs, and as gambling grew as a dangerous vice amongst the aristocracy, the popularity of horse racing skyrocketed. Anne was a fan, and late on in her reign she ordered the development of a new racecourse near the village of Ascot in Berkshire, a location which was ideal for Anne's reduced mobility, as it lay much closer to London and Westminster than Newmarket, and was less than 10 kilometres away from another royal residence, Windsor Castle. The track opened in 1711. Royal Ascot continues to memorialise Anne's patronage, with one of the parts of the grounds known as the Queen Anne Enclosure, while the first race on the first day of the race meeting at Ascot every year is known as the Queen Anne Stakes. The rift between Anne and Sarah never fully healed. This had implications for the war effort against France and Spain, which had dragged on for years. The Battle of Oudenarde and other victories had given the British, the Dutch and the Austrians the upper hand by the early 1710s. Still, there were clandestine negotiations being carried out between some Tory-aligned members of Anne's government with the French to see what terms could be found to end the war and the enormous financial strain it was placing on all parties. This ran against the Churchills' interest, with Marlborough pushing for an invasion of France and a strike against Paris, a measure which would bring fresh expense. In the midst of promoting this lavish scheme, he suddenly had charges pressed against him by his enemies in Parliament and the government, who accused him of embezzling huge sums of money in his position as head of the military during the war. Marlborough was able to refute many of the more ludicrous accusations. Nonetheless, in a sign of how much Anne and Sarah had drifted apart, the Queen dismissed him as the wartime leader in December 1711. The French were delighted, and concerted peace talks now commenced. Marlborough and Sarah went into voluntary exile, touring Central Europe, where the great victor of Blenheim and Oudenarde was fated. With his departure from the scene, the Treaty of Utrecht was agreed in 1713, largely ending the War of the Spanish Succession. Philip of Anjou was recognized as the new King of Spain, provided that the thrones of France and Spain would never be held by the same member of the French House of Bourbon. Britain gained Gibraltar and Minorca, as well as extensive trading concessions in the Atlantic, most of which dubiously led to a huge spike in its role in the transatlantic slave trade. It was a victory of sorts for Anne's government, and Gibraltar remains a British possession to this day, though more might have been hoped for had Marlborough been left in place to finish the war. By the time the first of the peace treaties were being signed at Utrecht in the Low Countries in 1713, Anne's health was seriously declining. She had always been plagued by ill health of one kind or another, and now, in her late 40s, things deteriorated further. For instance, while she had been limited in her mobility for many years, she had retained the ability to take to her feet and walk short distances. That is, until the spring of 1713, when she effectively lost all ability to remain on her feet. There were also a growing number of occasions on which she suffered from fevers or other maladies which prevented her from attending meetings with government ministers or other state events. When she did manage to, her patience was stretched by the effective head of the government, Robert Harley, 1st Earl of Oxford, a Tory-leaning politician who had been Marlborough's chief opponent for years. He had descended into alcoholism in recent times and often showed up to government meetings drunk. Thus it was, with her family members, children and husband long gone, her oldest friend in exile with her husband on the continent, and overseeing a government headed by a borderline alcoholic, that Anne spent her last 2 years. She suffered a stroke on the 30th of July 1714, the 14th anniversary of her son Prince William's death, one which left her unable to speak. Anne died at 49 years of age the following morning. Her physician, John Arbuthnot, in writing to the author of Gulliver's Travels, political pamphleteer and satirist Jonathan Swift, remarked of Anne's death that, "I believe sleep was never more welcome to a weary traveller than death was to her." Her body was so badly swollen from gout and dropsy that she had to be interred in an outsized, square-shaped coffin. She was laid to rest next to her husband and her many children who had died in infancy in the Collegiate Chapel of St. Peter's in Westminster